Hi there, and welcome to another episode of the Future of Jewish podcast. I'm your host, Joshua Hoffman. On this episode, I am joined by Simon Plosker. He is the managing editor of UN Watch, a nonprofit organization dedicated to holding the United Nations accountable to its founding principles. From 2005 to 2020, Plosker was the managing editor of HonestReporting, following several years working in a variety of nonprofit organizations and immigrating to Israel from London in 2001. Enjoy my conversation with Simon Plosker. Simon, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me. Why don't you start by telling us who you are, where you're from, and ultimately how you got to where you are today?
Okay, first of all, thank you for having me on. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm very flattered that you think my story's worth telling in a way. So you'll hear from my accent that I'm actually British. I was born in northwest London, and I grew up, there are probably a lot of American listeners. So if you picture the London Underground, if you know the lines on there, the underground lines, you have the Northern Line, the Black Line, and right at the end of it is a place called Edgware. It's about 5 stops from a place called Golders Green, which I'm sure a lot of people know. That entire area, there's a lot of Jews. So, I had a very much a traditional Jewish upbringing. My 99-year-old grandmother still lives in Golders Green, actually. That's it, really. I'm now living in Israel. I'm talking to you from Israel. I moved here in 2001, made Aliyah. But certainly, if we're thinking about how I got on a track where I ended up working at various sort of pro-Israel advocacy organizations, then I think the place to begin is probably as a student. I was a student back in the mid-90s, which in a way was kind of the peace process years. It was relatively quiet on campus. I mean, today, a lot of people are very, very concerned about what's going on American campuses, UK campuses, with all the anti-Israel activities happening there. But back then, it was relatively quiet. I had actually spent a year in Israel before going to university. I was on something called the Federation of Zionist Youth Year Course. It was joint with Young Judea, an American organization that I'm sure a lot of people have heard of. So that was pretty much where I decided that I was going to come back to Israel. And everything I did from that point on was geared towards coming back to Israel, making Aliyah. And at university, I said it was kind of a relatively quiet period of time in terms of anti-Israel activities. We had the peace process years. But one thing that really does stick out, a kind of a turning point for me, was the night of November 4th, 1995, which you may remember was the assassination of Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. That was also the night where I was. There was a regional student gathering, a karaoke party. The Jewish societies, the Jewish students from my university and some of the surrounding places were having this sort of annual get together. So there was karaoke going on. And then a couple of us hear the news that Rabin has been shot, at which point we went off to somewhere else in the Hillel house and we started listening to the radio. And the news is kind of filtering through at that point. And eventually we heard the shocking and terrible news of Rabin's death. I certainly was devastated by this. And there were a few of us there who were clearly, very upset by this. And downstairs at this very moment in time, we can hear the karaoke party still going on. There's kind of Hava Nagila going on and, various pop songs. And, I went downstairs and I went to the regional chairperson who was organizing this. And I said, the Union of Jewish Students, which we were affiliated to, this is the British student umbrella organization for Jewish students. It's a Zionist organization. We really need to stop the party now. Something absolutely tragic has just happened. We need to turn this into, maybe an educational moment or something. Just clearly, karaoke is not the appropriate response right now. And the guy turns to me, he says, what are you talking about? We wouldn't shut this party down if the British Prime Minister had just been shot, or anyone else. We're carrying on. And that to me was incredibly, soul destroying, really. And I was really quite angry. And I thought to myself, what would I have done if I was in charge? If I was responsible for this, how would I have handled it? And I kept that thought in my mind. And later that year, we had the national gathering of Jewish students, the annual conference, where people are elected to various positions. And I got up at the regional gathering and I laid into this guy for what he had done at this karaoke party. And the bottom line was I ended up being elected as his successor. And, that was the point where, I actually had, I don't know about the power, but certainly, it was in my mind that I'm now in a position of leadership, that I can influence how Jewish students, what they're doing, educationally on campus. I'd already been elected as the Israel officer for my particular Jewish society. So I was kind of responsible for putting on Israel-related activities. So that was kind of my entry into pro-Israel education advocacy. And we had some issues on campus. Back in those days, there were radical Islamists, Islamic extremists on campus. They've been banned. There were times where they would set up their stalls at student events. And, there was one time I remember I started taking photos of the stall, and, the guy suddenly shouts, hey, and starts coming after me, and I'm not a particularly tall, big guy. So I ran for it. And, I actually ran past my own car to make sure I wasn't followed. But, whilst it sounds kind of dramatic now, I remember going back home to my parents in London, and I said, just you wait. Today's student is tomorrow's terrorist. And, this was back in the mid-90s. And unfortunately, we've seen since then that this is exactly where some of these terrorists started becoming radicalized. It was actually on campus through these organizations, Hizb ut-Tahrir, Al-Muhajirun. So, that was one area that we were fighting against as Jewish students. And another one was the far left, the extreme left. Now, I'm sure a lot of people are aware of what went on in the last few years in the UK with Jeremy Corbyn. So, Jeremy Corbyn clearly, no friend of Israel and no friend of the Jews. And, a lot of the people that followed him kind of grew up in the student movement, became radicalized there. So we had sort of a mixture, the sort of thing you didn't see back then on American campuses, sort of Marxists, Trotskyists, even Stalinists to a certain extent. All of them had one thing in common. They were incredibly anti-Israel. They don't believe in Israel's right to exist. And they were a significant, they had significant power within the national student movement at the time. And Jewish students had to organize through their own union to try and keep these people out of positions of power and use sort of, I don't really want to say it, it sounds almost conspiratorial, but sort of a Jewish voting bloc, if you will, to try and influence things. So that was kind of a foray into the radical student politics of the time. And that was really where I learned an awful lot. It kind of sounds, it sounds almost, I don't know about immature, but, a lot of things that went on then, you see the results of now, in terms of where politicians have ended up, journalists, these are people that came through the student movement. And that's kind of where we are today.
I'm curious to know from your vantage point, because a lot of what you're describing, from what I understand, in the 90s and maybe early 2000s, to me, maybe it's more amplified now because we have things like social media and smartphones, but it also just feels like there's just direct extensions from everything that you saw, 20, 30 years ago. I'm wondering now, when you look back, are things better, worse, about the same? How do you see it?
I think things are certainly worse. I think where British campuses were at a certain point, American campuses have caught up. Jewish students are, clearly having serious issues on a number of campuses in the States, Canada, elsewhere. And you mentioned social media. I think that really has been the biggest difference between today and back then. I remember, email was kind of a new form of communication back when I was starting this sort of thing. And, the internet was something that you kind of, you played on and surfed on with a very, very slow, phone line connection. Now, you've got, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all of these platforms, and it really has amplified the hate. It certainly amplified the way that, we as, advocates, Jewish educators, et cetera, it's amplified the way that we can reach people as well. But I think there's been a sea change since then, and it's really quite disturbing to see.
Where has the Jewish community, in your estimation, gone wrong in terms of the whole university environment? To me, I would say two things. I think one, it feels like the loud minority, meaning, I don't know what the numbers are, but 90% of university students don't think twice about Jews in Israel. They just go about their day. 5% are pro, and the other 5% are sort of anti. Those are certainly arbitrary numbers, but I guess what I'm saying is, like, first of all, do you agree with that sort of breakdown? And also, how do we, even if that's the case, how do we get this under our control, so to speak, so that we can turn around some of these worrisome trends?
Yeah, I think to an extent you're right. And I don't think it just applies to campuses. I think it applies generally. You'll find that sort of 90% of the general public, if you will, really don't care what's going on in Israel, the Middle East. Most have never met a Jew before. They're not bothered. It's not part of their everyday life. On the other hand, you have a very, well, you would hope a small minority, but they're extremely loud. And I think if you're talking about where we've gone wrong, we can look at it in two ways, if you will. The first, obviously, being Jewish students themselves. Now, a lot of Jewish students, they will go straight from their high schools straight to university, and there they will suddenly find themselves in a situation that they are completely unprepared for. And I don't necessarily, blame them for that. Given a choice between sort of sticking your head above the parapet and getting all the abuse and potential anti-Semitism, most of these students prefer to sort of, either bury their heads in the sand or ignore it. And at worst, some of them, particularly on the progressive political end, will actually start to sympathize with the same people that are being abusive towards Israel and Jewish students. It's a serious problem, but of course it begins before university. We have to reach these students, these young people, before they get onto campus. Now, I'm actually married to an American, so I do have some inkling of what goes on in the States. For example, in terms of Jewish education, it's incredibly expensive, which means that not every Jewish child is going to have access to education. Not only that, they're not necessarily going to have access to pro-Israel education, but it's not even, I don't think we need to necessarily start pushing Israel on kids or students. I think Israel has a compelling enough story of its own without us having to sort of, some people have turned this on its head and claims that the organized Jewish community is somehow brainwashing students, kids, whatever, into being supportive of Israel. Now, our parents and grandparents' generation, they remember what it was like before there was an Israel. And you don't necessarily have to sort of push the concept of a Jewish state on them. They kind of support it. But, a lot of younger people don't have the same connection to Israel as sort of the older generation now. And that's something that really needs to be worked on. I mean, there's certain things like birthright, for example, which have had an incredible impact. I actually have a cousin of mine. She went to Israel on birthright trip for the first time. Loved Israel so much. She hadn't really had much connection with it, but she loved the place. She came back, met an Israeli, and she actually got married to him. So these things can have an amazing result, and the figures actually prove this. So you've got to catch the younger people earlier. On the other hand, you actually got the people that we're actually fighting against. And I suppose in a way, a lot of that is my job. It has been for sort of the past 20 odd years. We have to expose these people because unfortunately they have managed to become part of the progressive or liberal landscape, when in fact, many of these people are not liberal at all. They're not progressive. They are, quite frankly, heading towards the fascist level, if you think about it, the way that they are moving towards anti-Semitism. Don't give me the, I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm anti-Zionist, or I just hate Israel. Well, you hate you basically from that, you hate sort of the 6 to 7 million Jews living in Israel right now. You're not bothered about Israeli policies, you're bothered about Israel's very existence. And so much of the activity that's going on aimed against Israel is not, like the boycott, divestment and sanctions campaign, BDS. It's not having an impact on Israel at all. We see Israel is thriving economically, culturally, even in its security as well, its relations with other countries in the world, including in the Middle East. So BDS is having a negligible impact on Israel, but it's having a huge impact on Jewish students and diaspora Jewish communities. And that's where the problem lies now.
So it's interesting because, by the way, I want to get to some of your more recent work. I mean, you were the managing editor at NGO Monitor. You were managing editor again at HonestReporting for something like 14 years. And now more recently, the managing editor, quite recently, actually, well, I guess not so much, almost 2 years now at UN Watch. But before we get into that, I want to ask you, so you mentioned BDS, and BDS is obviously sort of the most well-known anti-Israel movement today, but there's others, and there will always be others in the future. I understand like your work over the last maybe 20 years or so has been sort of in this realm, but I do ask you genuinely as a so-called outsider, if we fight this fight, are we not in a way giving legitimacy to an otherwise illegitimate group of people? Meaning, if we acknowledge them through media, through campaigns, through our own type of movements, and obviously investing a lot of resources in them, that level of acknowledgement to me feels like that it sort of justifies or legitimizes these sort of bad actors. What do you say to that?
I think it's an interesting point you're making. However, I think kind of the horse has already bolted in this case, because these people, as I said, they're very loud, but unfortunately the message is actually getting out there, mainly because of social media. And I'm very much minded that if we just said, well, these people are extremists, let's just ignore them. Well, quite frankly, you're just letting the playing field, you're clearing it for them. And then they start to influence not only, ordinary, people out there, members of the general public, students, but they start to influence us as well. They influence our own kids, our own students. So if we're not sort of fighting back against them, then we're just letting them play by their own rules. And I think it's important that, I mean, one of the things that I said sort of honest reporting, that one person alone may not make a difference, but together thousands can. And we used to try and, encourage people to bombard, the newspapers, the editors with letters, for example. And, not everyone was going to sit down and actually write a letter to an editor. It wasn't going to happen. But with social media, it could have been something as simple as pressing share on a piece of content. It's actually much easier than you think to be able to take action. And I think that's also part of the education as well. So many of the things that I wrote about, it wasn't just about sort of having a go back at the enemy, if you will. It was educating our own side about the issues, because so many of them are uneducated about it. And that's where we had to come in and do that job.
I'm curious about some of these strategies in terms of what you call fighting back. You spent a few decades now, as I said, between NGO Monitor, Honest Reporting, and now UN Watch. What are some of the strategies, especially the ones where you were like, I don't really know if this is going to work. Like, I don't feel 100% about it, but then it turned out to be something that was quite fruitful. What are some of those that you can share with us during your time at these 3 different organizations?
Okay. I could go back quite a few years now, sort of, I suppose, if you want to call it the dawn of Twitter, before, it's huge now, and obviously, Elon Musk buying it, it's worth a large amount of money. But, back in the day, it wasn't so widely used, but the journalists and the opinion formers were there from the beginning. And one memory I have is exposing, she was a senior Middle East editor for CNN, Octavia Nasser was her name, and she tweeted how sorry she was to hear of the death of one of Hezbollah's founders in Lebanon. Now, Hezbollah obviously is a terrorist group. Don't just take it from me or the Israelis. This is a terrorist group as classified by the US, Canada, the European Union, et cetera, et cetera. So we asked this question: how is it possible that a senior editor at CNN is publicly proclaiming how sad she is at the death of a founder of a terrorist organization? And we put it out there on Twitter. And within 48 hours, she was gone from the job, fired. That was a really, a big piece of, it was a big thing back then, a big result. And that was, that was certainly an example of how you could have power on Twitter even back then, to promote your cause, or at least expose when someone's doing something wrong. Other things I can think of, over the years, I've got hundreds and hundreds of corrections in the media. And people have asked me, Simon, what was the point? It may be, if you're lucky, it's going to be buried on, page 17 of the New York Times. Well, it's not a waste of time, because, everything is online these days. Everything is kept online, for years and years. It's all archived. And when people go to do a Google search and they start looking for some incident that happened, for example, and there they will maybe have the original article they found in the New York Times, the Guardian, the Washington Post, or wherever. But you'll also see a rebuttal, a response from an organization like Honest Reporting. And that, of course, is potentially educating someone that not only there may be 2 sides to a story, but one side may actually have got it completely wrong and corrected it later as well. So I think it's very important for the record that action was taken.
No, I think that's a good point. It seems like it feels what we would call in the business world B2B as opposed to B2C, which is still important.
Right. I think there are many ways of looking at that. Some people also said, well, aren't you just preaching to the choir? Well, look, in a sense, you're preaching to a few different places. The first one being the choir, and you've got to keep your base motivated, educated, because without them, you have nothing. And these are the people that are going to spread the message ultimately, be it on social media, either sharing content, or just the people that are actually going to take action. The people who want to be making those complaints to the media, to wherever else. Also, you've got the media themselves. You've got to be out there talking to them. And I know from experience, there were a lot of journalists I had contact with, people that, would not be happy if I suddenly said on a podcast that I went out for a coffee with them. They wouldn't want to be seen to be sitting with someone who was the managing editor of an organization that was necessarily getting corrections off them or attacking their media outlets. But these were people that said, look, we don't necessarily like what you're doing, but we respect it. And there's a place for it, because otherwise, who's going to be holding the media to account for their own mistakes, their errors? I actually had good relations with quite a few journalists in Israel. That sometimes it was actually better to be able to send a quick message, either email or WhatsApp, and say, hey, there's a serious mistake here, be it the headline or something in one of these paragraphs. You got the facts wrong here. Do you mind changing it? And quite a lot of the time, you could actually get a result from simply being civil and being, I don't know about nice, but being straight with them. And that would sometimes give a lot of results. At the same time, you've got plenty of other journalists who are stationed in Israel. They have an agenda. You're not going to convince them, one way or another. And these people need to be held to account. They need to be watched, and you need to get the corrections off them. And if that requires sort of a weight of numbers and many complaints and exposing them, then so be it. It's not my job to be popular.
So what's interesting about the organizations that you've worked at, and generally like what I'll call the Jewish/Israel media landscape, is that it's predominantly nonprofit, right? And so then that kind of begs the question, well, I mean, listen, there's pros and cons for the for-profit media and the nonprofit media, but my feeling is that it's so heavily nonprofit in the Jewish world. So then you start asking, well, who's behind these organizations? Like, who's behind UN Watch? Who's behind Honest Reporting? Who's behind Israel 21C, for example? And you can go down the list. It feels to me sometimes that on a high level, I don't want to single out any organization, that there's just an overemphasis on showing the best of Israel and overcompensating for Israel's good, bad, and ugly. And I'm just wondering, like, in a world where authenticity reigns supreme now more than ever, I would say, how does that land with you? I mean, is what I'm saying, do you feel that it has some sort of weight, or do you say, at for-profit, nonprofit, it doesn't matter. Each organization has their own mission, so be it?
I think, and I remember back when I started working at Honest Reporting, which was the back end of 2005, my personal thoughts on the organization at the time were that it had been a bit too much of the pro-Israel, if you want to call it Hasbara, which I don't like that word, but sort of a bit too much of the rah Israel stuff. And I think you're right. I think authenticity is important. I said earlier that I think Israel has a very compelling story to tell, warts and all. I'll just give you an example. Settlements. This is not a consensus issue within Israel, within Jewish communities around the world. It's certainly, a big issue when it comes to Israel's diplomatic relations with other countries. Now, there may be some organizations that are ideologically motivated to promote or defend settlements. For me, that wasn't the issue. It wasn't about defending settlements. It was about making sure people understood what the issue actually was. And I'll give you an example. I remember one time the New York Times did a feature article, and it was talking about the settlement of Ariel. It's a city in the West Bank, Judea-Samaria. I can't remember exactly how many people live there now. I think at a certain point it was sort of 20, 30,000 people. So it's big. They illustrated it with a photo of a tent on a windswept hillside. Now, if you're looking at that photo and you have no idea what a a Jewish settlement looks like, then you're going to think, well, what's the issue here? It must be really easy to evacuate these Jewish settlers because they're living in tents, on hills. So what's the problem here? And it's only when you start to realize that they are real people living in these cities or towns, these settlements, that you realize that this is not a simple issue at all. And that's before we get into the whole area of whether these territories are disputed or not, which I believe they are. I want people to be able to be educated to the extent that they're able to make up their own minds about these issues, that they're educated enough. And I think I think the saddest thing that we've had over the last few decades is how nuance has been eliminated from the discussion and the debate. I think it's worse with social media now, but we have the other side, if you will, that are going to the extremes where, we're talking about, Israel has no right to exist. Israel is an apartheid state, which of course by its very definition, the implication being that if it is an apartheid state, then it really has no right to exist. And we're caught in a trap here whereby we need to fight back. But if we were to, for example, just acknowledge that there are serious issues with Israeli policy, and there are some serious issues. I live here. There are several million prime ministers living in this country who criticize this country's policies every day of the week. So if anyone ever tells you that, we're trying to shut down the discussion about Israel, well, that's entirely untrue. But the biggest problem is that if someone says, I disagree with this I'm pro-Israel and I disagree with this Israeli policy, it is immediately pounced on by the anti-Israel mob and used against you. And there's no sort of black and white, nothing in the middle there where we can say, Israel is an amazing country, it has issues, some of which need to be dealt with, or perhaps, there are huge issues in terms of how Palestinians live day to day. I would be, kidding myself if I were to go around telling people that the lives of Palestinians are absolutely fantastic, that they live absolutely wonderful lives, under, either Palestinian Authority rule, Hamas rule, or under Israeli security rule. Clearly, it's not a good situation to be in. Now, the issue really is, is it possible to try and fix these problems? Is it possible to try and bring understanding between both sides so that we may be able to move forward? And unfortunately, I think we've reached, if you want to call it a game, I don't think it's a very fun game at all, but if you look at it as a game, it's become zero sum. Certainly for the pro-Palestinian side, the Israelis have to lose for the Palestinians to gain. I would say that I'd be pro-Palestinian. I am in favor of a two-state solution. I'm in favor of the Palestinians having a state of their own, having some sort of self-determination. But does that mean that I'm going to support this at the cost of Israeli suicide and the end of Israel as a Jewish state? No, absolutely not. So in that sense, unfortunately, we're not seeing much in the way of movement or understanding on either side, really. And I think it's certainly worse on the Palestinian side because you only have to look at the some of the methodology that's being used here. We talk about incitement against Jews, against Israelis, and it goes all the way from that to its logical conclusion, which is horrific, fatal terrorist attacks aimed at Israeli civilians, and of course that also affects Jews in the diaspora as well.
I want to go back to your comment about the disputed territories, and you talked about words like nuance and context. You talked about a two-state solution. Can you just go a little deeper with us? Because some people, when they hear the term disputed territories, I think they either don't fully know what it means, or they don't know what you mean by it, or where you stand in terms of why you believe what you believe. Can you just give some more context and nuance there? Because I think it's quite valuable to talk about that.
Okay, I mean, we can talk about what is today, I mean, for most people known as the West Bank, that area, West Bank of the Jordan River, was previously under Jordanian occupation up until 1967. This is an area that is I suppose, the biblical heartland of the Jewish people. Many historical religious Jewish sites there. For example, we talk about Hebron, for example. I could start, giving, this whole sort of God gave this land to us. Now, I don't think that works on a regular mainstream audience. It will work for religious Jews. It will work for religious evangelical Christians as well. But most people in today's world are towards the secular side. They're not thinking about sort of whether God is involved at all. So let's remove. I don't want to remove God from this, because God is, for many Jewish people, is an important part of their religious identity, of course. But if I were to go anywhere in Israel right now, including that area, that disputed area, and I start digging, I will find traces of my ancestors, of Jews who've been there, for 3,000 years. This is a land that, I mean, not only is the Holy Land, if you will, but it's basically the Jewish homeland. It is the one place that Jews were together as a nation, as people. And, this is incredibly important. And, so we can move from that. We can also move to sort of the legal arguments over this, in terms of, people say, well, the Palestinians are claiming that, the Jews, Israel, took their land from them. Well, the reality is essentially that there was no Palestinian state before Israel was created. Modern day Israeli state was created in 1948. This was land that was under the Ottoman Empire, and then, of course, the British Mandate had control of it as well. So there are various, legalistic arguments one can make about, whose land is it.
I want to ask you about that, though, because, and this will, I think, be the last question on this topic before I want to get to UN Watch and some of the things that you're doing with the UN. But I want to, there's this concept that I'm learning in my personal life, the difference between being smart and being right. And so I think the arguments that you're making are the right arguments, meaning they're logical, they're based on fact, they're based on history. In 2022, moving forward, in your estimation, are they the smart path forward? I asked that genuinely. I don't know the answer to the question. I'm just curious, to the extent that you feel it's smart to sort of make that argument today and moving forward.
You're right. It's a very difficult question to answer. And I think a lot depends on the audience. I mentioned before, Jewish audiences, Christian audiences, left-wing audiences, right-wing audiences. I don't think there's a correct answer that would fit all of these people in there on all sides. There isn't. People tend to sort of put the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or the Arab-Israeli conflict, within the sort of the box, the context, the framing that they see things in, either their own personal politics, their religious identity, etc., etc. So I think one does have to be smart when we're trying to promote Israel. Whether we're right or not, again, I'm not sure there is an answer there, because essentially, we have everyone in Israel arguing over different policies. Many of these policies, some people in Israel agree with them, people outside disagree with them. I see other countries that state that they are friends and allies of Israel disagreeing vehemently with certain policies. And I think we also have to be right. One of the things about being right or smart also comes down to the whole issue of anti-Semitism. I get extremely upset when I see people on our own side who suddenly have a go at someone and call them an anti-Semite because they've said something that they disagree with. Now, there's a big difference between people having an issue with Israeli policies and disagreeing with something from hopefully an educated standpoint, and someone who's a genuine Jew hater or wants to see the end of Israel. And I find it incredibly disheartening when I see supposedly intelligent people who won't argue in a logical, informed way, but will simply, shout, anti-Semite. And not only that, it plays into the other side's hands, because one of the arguments that's regularly used against us is that we are trying to shut down the conversation by claiming that, the people who are arguing against us are anti-Semitic. I think that's absolute nonsense. And one of the biggest things I think we've seen in the last sort of several years has been the widespread adoption of the IRA definition, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition of anti-Semitism, which gives a very good grounding as to what actually constitutes anti-Semitism. It gives examples, and it also relates to Israel as well. And I think one of the key points here is that so many of the extremists, the anti-Israel extremists, have opposed this definition precisely because it exposes why and where their anti-Semitism is coming from.
Let's get to UN Watch now. First of all, it's a fascinating organization. If you haven't heard about it, it's a nonprofit that is dedicated to holding the UN accountable to its founding principles. Simon, I find it ironic, to say the least, that the very organization that, in a very simplified way of putting it, gave the Jews Israel, is now, I don't know, one of its so-called biggest enemies. I mean, how do you take us through, sort of in your eyes and through the eyes of UN Watch, sort of the evolution of like UN in 1948 and a few years before then, in terms of, the founding of Israel, to now, where, there's an entire organization that you're the managing editor at, in which there's just a lot of, as you said, anti-Semitic and anti-Israel rhetoric and behavior and action. And fortunately, your organization is sort of holding them accountable to the extent that you can.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like finding out that, you've got an abusive parent in a way. You're right. The United Nations really kind of gave birth to Israel. And today the situation is problematic, to say the least. But I think one thing you have to remember, we're talking about, the UN is against Israel. The UN is, it's made up of 193 member states. And the UN itself is only as good as those 193 states. And unfortunately, a vast number of those states, they're not places we would want to live. They are not friendly liberal democracies. And there are a lot of countries that are, they're obviously anti-Israel. We know that. You've got different blocks within the UN. You've got the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, for example, which has a go at Israel. We have the Arab League. We've got various states which one could consider to be, in a way, pariah states. States that abuse human rights. One of Israel's biggest problems right now is on the UN Human Rights Council. We have sort of 47-member council where only maybe a third of those states are actually fit to be sitting on a human rights council. The majority are states like, well, up until recently, we had Russia, which amazingly was actually kicked off the council, suspended, but we still have China, Venezuela, Cuba, Eritrea, all sorts of countries, that Libya, countries that really do not deserve to be there at all. And one of the things that a favorite of these countries to try and distract attention from their own abuses is to attack Israel. Israel is the only country in the world that has its own agenda item at each Human Rights Council session. We have agenda item 2, which is dedicated to human rights issues in the whole of the world, apart from Israel, which has its own agenda item 7. I mean, the UN is founded on the UN Charter, seeing nations as equals. Yet Israel is not seen as an equal within the United Nations system. It's actually picked on and abused. And over the years, the UN has grown. There have been more states, since 1948, obviously, and we have a lot of political developments in that time. Decolonization. You've got a lot of countries in the 60s, for example, that broke free from their colonial rulers, be that sort of Britain, France, Belgium, etc., etc. And unfortunately, thanks to Soviet propaganda, Israel has been portrayed wrongly, falsely, libelously portrayed as a colonialist state. It's turned into a sort of, Israel colonizing the Palestinians, taking their land. And, this kind of reached a crescendo in 1975, where we had a resolution passed, the infamous resolution of 3379, which declared Zionism to be a form of racism. Now, this really was an absolute nadir in the United Nations history. And while it was repealed in 1991, we've seen its rejuvenation over the last 20 odd years. We had only a few days before the September 11 attacks back in 2001, only the week before those attacks, there was a Durban conference, a UN conference against racism held in Durban, South Africa, which turned into an anti-Israel hate fest, an anti-Semitic hate fest. People who went there had never seen anything like it. The worst example of anti-Semitism in the post-war era. And that really was the birth of the campaign that we see today, the BDS campaign, the campaign to portray Israel as an apartheid state. And unfortunately, we had a war, obviously, in Israel versus Palestinian versus Hamas, rather, in Gaza over a year ago. And the Human Rights Council, in its infinite non-wisdom, decided to create a commission of inquiry. And it's open-ended. It means it can it can keep going as long as it wants. It's being chaired by someone called Navi Pillay. She's a South African judge. She used to be the president of the Human Rights Council, where she was very, very anti-Israel. She's on record calling Israel an apartheid state. She's not impartial. This is not someone who should be investigating Israel in any sense. And yet here we are. This commission of inquiry is ongoing, and it is going to be pronouncing Israel as an apartheid state. This will, we believe, will be the first time where an official UN body, an investigation, declares Israel as an apartheid state. And that is something that UN Watch is currently fighting against, trying to educate as well. There's a Human Rights Council session that will be taking place in June 2022, where this commission will be reporting. UN Watch will be holding various side events with guest speakers, including, Israeli Arabs, for example, who will be able to say exactly why the country they live in is not an apartheid state. That we will be also putting forward our own statements, speeches to the Human Rights Council as well, defending Israel's case. And it's really all about holding the United Nations to the standard of its own charter, which at the moment is being abused to beat Israel.
But on the Israel side, there's got to be things that the state of Israel can and maybe should be doing either better or different, right? I mean, is there anything that stands out to you when I say that kind of stuff?
Look, I think one thing that people have to realize is that the world of the United Nations doesn't necessarily bear any reality to what goes on outside. So I'll give you an example. We had the Abraham Accords, but are those same countries, the Arab countries that Israel is suddenly getting, good and open relationships with, Bahrain, Morocco, etc. Do they vote? Are they voting in favor of Israel now at the United Nations? No, they're not. So what goes on in the UN doesn't necessarily bear out in reality what goes on outside. Israel has very good relations with many countries in the European Union. But unfortunately, when it comes to votes at the United Nations, many of these countries, despite declaring themselves to be friends of Israel, aren't voting with them. There are exceptions.
Why is that? Why is that in your estimation?
It's a very difficult question to answer. I think sometimes a lot of these countries, they do disagree with Israeli policies. As far as they're concerned, a lot of these resolutions against Israel, they don't want to be seen to be voting against them because they value their relationships with some of these other countries, which are quite powerful. There may be oil producing countries involved. And there's a lot of sort of give and take within the UN in terms of, I'll vote for you for this position if you support us on this. And let's be honest, there's not that much, to be lost by voting against Israel. Israel, whilst we have friends in the UN, there aren't many countries that are prepared to stick their necks out when it comes to defending Israel. The United States certainly will. Britain has come out and declared it will not support resolutions under this Human Rights Council Agenda Item 7. But whilst that sounds great in theory, in practice, what it meant was they started trying to move some of these resolutions to the other agenda item with all the other countries, so they could then, vote however they felt like. So there's serious issues there, and unfortunately, Israel is not in the most powerful position when it comes to the 192 other member states.
I'm curious, you've now been working as the managing editor at UN Watch for about almost 2 years now. What's something that you thought about the UN before you took this position that you have since either changed your mind about or come to learn something different?
I think one thing I realized was that there needs to be a UN Watch, because no one is paying attention otherwise to some of the stuff that's going on within the UN system. And it's absolutely mind-boggling. It's not just about Israel. A lot of the stuff we do involves various human rights abusing countries holding the UN to the standards of its own charter. Now, if I were to tell you that Iran just took its seat on the Commission for the Status of Women, that is absolutely appalling. A country that forces women to wear the hijab, that has a terrible human rights record, is now sitting on the highest UN body dealing with the rights of women. And if I tell you that the Saudis just got elected to that body very recently as well, they'll be taking up a seat sort of in the next year as well. That to me is incredible. And we have the Chinese who are taking various positions on various bodies at the moment as well, and using, quite frankly, what is soft power to try and increase their influence over the UN system. You see all sorts of just bizarre things happening.
And so I guess my question though is like, if somebody's listening to this and they're saying, wow, this is appalling, this is ridiculous, this is something that I'm glad that there's a UN Watch that can educate me, but like, what else can people do outside of, for example, following, you on social media or subscribing to your newsletter? Like, are there action items? Is it simply a project of education and dissemination of information? What are some of the action items, if any, here?
Right. I think obviously it is important that your listeners follow us on unwatch.org and on social media as well, Twitter, Facebook. But I think apart from the education side of things, I think one of the issues really is that certainly in the democratic world, so many people are not following what is going on, what their own governments do within the UN, because it's not important to them. Most people don't really follow what goes on with the UN until it comes to some Security Council resolution authorizing military action, for example. But there's so much more that's going on. And if people were to educate themselves, then they would be in a position to start writing to their representatives in Congress or in the UK Houses of Parliament or the Canadian Parliament or wherever, and start to ask the difficult questions. And there have been times where European states have been embarrassed, where we've called out how is it that Iran can get elected to this body? It means that a certain number of European states had to have voted for them. And, it's embarrassing. We did this with the Iranians. And we found that all of a sudden you had politicians who start asking their government, which way did we vote? And then, it starts coming out, and then there's a big fuss. You get a sort of a critical mass of coverage in the media, and then people start asking those questions, the important questions. What is our policy towards the United Nations? How do we treat Israel at the United Nations? Are we just going to let these human rights abusers get elected to these bodies? Are we just going to let them control the agenda?
So it seems to me that you really do some thankless work in many ways. Does it sometimes feel discouraging or just a never-ending uphill battle? I mean, what keeps you energized every day?
You know what? Sometimes I wonder how I've remained vaguely sane over all these years. It can be very, very difficult. But ultimately, it's a mission. And you mentioned the differences between profits and non-profits. So many of my colleagues in non-profit organizations, non-governmental organizations, clearly we don't do this for the money. We do this because this is a mission for us, and we think it's incredibly important. We can't just rely on the Israeli government to start making the case. We can't rely on other countries to start taking up arms against the behavior of certain other countries within the UN or against Israel, and so on and so forth. So I keep going because number one, you have to. Number two, it can be very rewarding. We get results, and I do think, I wonder what would be the situation now if there weren't people dedicated to trying to solve these problems. Otherwise, if we just let it sit there, stagnate and overtake us, the situation will be perhaps even worse than it is now. And, people say, well, maybe you're not making a massive impact. Well, I think that this war may go on for, who knows, long after I'm gone, perhaps, long after my own children are gone. But I have to keep believing that I can make things better for them, for next generation of young Jews who are coming through the system, going onto their own campuses. My own parents as well. My parents in the UK and lived with the fear for a few years that Jeremy Corbyn would be potentially a prime minister. For them as Jews, this was a scary prospect, and that was defeated in large part because the Jewish community there stood up and held fast against what was happening. And these are the things where I think we can make a difference. We should make a difference, and not just about our own Jewish nation, people, and communities. For me, at the moment, it's also about. It sounds kind of a bit soppy in a way, but making the world a better place. If I'm dealing with the United Nations, which claims to be trying to make the world a better place, well, I'm going to try and make the United Nations a better place as well.
Well said. It reminds me of the quote, I think it was Hillel the Elder, who said, it's not your job to finish the work, but neither are you free to refuse it. And so I think what you guys are doing is incredibly important. Thank you so much for the work that you do for Israel, for the Jewish people. And thank you for your time for doing this episode.
Thank you for having me.